Good morning, my name is Mackenzie Jordan and I'm from Treaty 6 and right now I reside in Vancouver in British Columbia. I just want to welcome everybody here to the Congress. Today we're going to hear from 5 amazing Indigenous women. Our panel is Indigenous Women and Girls in North America, how prostitution is a continuation of colonialism and the historical oppression of Indigenous women. So first off, we're just really going to have the women answer to that about in their own lives and in the other Indigenous women that they support. And I'm going to ask Bridget to start.
Ani, my name is Hosea Quay. My English name is Bridget Perrier. I was born and raised in northwestern Ontario, where I was lovingly placed up for adoption at the request of my birth mother was to be adopted into a non-native home. I had a great family. I grew up with parents that were good people. The only thing was my mom was working with men that had been abused by the church. I suffered sexual abuse, adoption breakdown, and by 11, 12, I was basically, my parents were told that it was a failed adoption. I grew up in a city where being Native was a bad thing, and I hid who I was. It didn't take me long. By the age of 12, I was lured into prostitution out of a child welfare run group home. My recruiter was my own sibling. I do not blame her. It is what it is. It was my biological sister. To this day, I am her caretaker. I was one of the girls that was brought on the ships on the Great Lakes. I experienced brutal exploitation. I was involved in a Canadian scandal with a Crown attorney and underage girls. I was able to exit due to a loss of a child. My son's pinky promise was for me to do good and be good, and then he died. I didn't have any resources on how to exit, how to rebuild my life, so I left Thunder Bay, and with that, I found out I was pregnant again in Toronto. And I found safety within the domestic violence. I knew better not to say what my experience was. And I knew, just to basically, minimize. And I remember giving birth. And before I gave birth, the doctor who I had a high-risk pregnancy pulled me aside and said to me, "Were you sexually abused? You have something, what I would say is trauma wound." Because he worked with women in war, he knew my insides. There was something wrong, and I burst out crying and I told him my story. And he said, "I kind of figured something, but we also have to tell you, there's a birth alert." And they were to take my child. They didn't take my child. Mount Sinai Hospital protected me and worked with me. They knew I was doing good and I had the right supports. It was awful when I gave birth because I didn't know about being a mother and I didn't know about the feelings around breastfeeding and all that. And simple stuff like that, survivors go through. So I ended up having my daughter and doing quite well, and met a man. I met a guy in Toronto and went like this, "My kids are in Vancouver, Bridget, can you go get them?" I said, "Okay, I'll go get them." And I remember the handoff of my daughters Angel and Destiny. Their mother was Brenda Wolf. And I went to her, she was staying in like a hotel, rooming hotel in Chinatown in Hastings. And I didn't want it to be complicated. Me and this worker, I went and got the girls. And they were scared of me. They didn't know who the hell I was. I was just their daddy's girlfriend. And I, told Brenda, it's all right. I have a 1-800 number, Brenda. At that time, you could get a 1-800 number. And I said, whenever you want, just call it and you can talk to your girls. And she regularly called me, and one time she disappeared. When I reported her missing, I was told, she's on vacation. Heroin addicts don't go on vacation. And then the cop basically said, lady, who cares? She's gone. You have her kids. And I just knew something was wrong. I was around 7 months pregnant with my third child, and in Thunder Bay, and we had a knock on the door, and it went something like this. I'm Sergeant so-and-so from the Missing Women Task Force, and you have 2 children that we need to take DNA from. Angel had told us about this meeting a week before that. Me and my mom thought she was telling tall tales. What happened, me and my mom sat in shock. That little story my child told us about, with the microphone on the table, was happening, and they wanted DNA. My daughter's birth mom, Brenda's jawbone was found on the pig farm. So my father ended up kicking them all out. Detective Russo and the victim service worker got asked to leave. And that was when my dad looked at us and said, we need legal representation. They knocked back on the door and said, also, Bridget has a Canada-wide warrant. They were basically wanting the DNA, or they were going to turn me in. And my dad said, we'll have the warrant taken care of. A good thing we did. I got a conditional sentence. My kids were safe. I never gave them DNA. She had a mother. They could have got DNA from her. I raised my daughters in that limelight. Whenever problems happened with my little girls, it was because they were Native. And they would be, subjected to, Picton victims and that. And I realized something as an Indigenous woman that survived the sex trade, that we had to watch. We had to watch law enforcement. We had to really, be vigilant. My father ended up telling me that one time he went to report me missing, and my dad was a fraud investigator in Northwestern Ontario, and they told him, Larry, don't say she's Native, we won't look for her. So I always had that in the back of my mind. Going through the inquiry, the BC Missing Women inquiry was a shit show, it was a joke. It pitted family members after family members. The non-Native family members were treated way different than the Indigenous family members. We were given pork, bologna for a feast when the non-Native families had a big spread from, we were treated massively different. Actually, Angel and I were treated quite well because they were scared of me. They were scared of me in the press. And I made sure my child, I said, this is time, we gotta warrior up for your mother. And that little girl warriored up for her mom. And I felt that Brenda has always been present in my life. I always pray to her and it was weird because I had a dream of Brenda not too long ago, and she said, Mary Bridget, I got yours and you take care of mine. It was weird because my youngest daughter was in bed with me, and she said, Mom, that Native lady in the bed who kept on playing with my hair. And I was like, oh fuck, okay, visions do happen. So for me, it was community support. I was a part of Persepa. I spoke at the standing committee about the harms prostitution has caused me and caused other Indigenous women, because they don't look for us. I also advocated for the national inquiry, which was a shit show, waste of time, because it's just another tabled report. So there's 2 reports that are tabled. It didn't do anything, it didn't make it easier. Being a mom and being a survivor, my children, and I have 5 daughters, are more susceptible to be pulled into the sex trade. And believe it or not, having a mom like me, you'd think my kids wouldn't. My youngest daughter started showing signs of substance abuse. And we were trying to get her help. August 6th, I had a knock on the door and it went like this. "Are you Bridget?" And he said, "Yeah." I thought the Toronto police were at my door because of my little boy that I adopted. And I was like, "Okay, what are you doing here?" And they said, "Are you Soleil Perrier's mom?" And I said, "Yeah." "Yeah, what did she do?" And they said, "Oh, when's the last time you seen her?" And I said, "Monday." I'm standing on my front porch in Toronto, and the officer's on the sidewalk, which is about 30, probably from me to you. And I'm standing up and she goes, "Are you sure you seen her Monday? Because that's impossible, she's dead." And I was like, the neighbor said it just was screams from hell. My daughter had been complaining that a pimp had been bothering her and she had gotten pregnant. I got her to terminate the pregnancy. He wouldn't leave her alone. He was controlling her with drugs. We were concerned, me and my partner, who's anti-gang, he runs a exiting program, and I'm going, my child's dead. I'm on the floor. And they didn't even have the decency to have an advocate there. My daughter had to be told by my niece's boyfriend because he said, "Mom's freaking out, So-So's dead." Now, the coroner in Toronto owns methadone, has his hands in the pot too. And I kept on saying to my daughter, "Don't say we're fucking native," because they don't care. Well, we got a good detective. He did care, he has daughters. Soleil's abuser was arrested on failing to provide support. They couldn't take him. Her death has been ruled a homicide. But he urinated on my kid before he left. He didn't call anyone. It was awful. It was just a shit show. And what followed it has been a shit show. I've filed people, which I said, "Oh yeah, hi," and the follow-up. What they said would have came out of that inquiry didn't come out. And I'm lucky that who I am, they did listen to me, and Soleil was able to advocate for herself in the grave. But this just happened August. I'm still grieving. I'm still, having to build up for my daughters, for her sisters who lost their mom to Picton and now lost a sister to another man. And it's estimated he killed 7 Indigenous women. And that was one of his things he said to Soleil, is, "You're a dirty fucking squaw, and I'll kill you and no one will care." And he didn't realize who her mommy was, because someone does care. And I think what, we need to do now is to hold the government accountable. Let's start, we have the law, we have an inquiry, we know what's right, but what is right for us First Nations, for us Anishinaabe, is we need to go back to the old ways. We need land-based healing, we need the opportunities. We need to listen to our Indigenous survivors. I always get every week, Bridget, I have someone for you. I'm like, why? She told you to F off? Because they don't understand the compounds, the layers, you know, the 60 scoop, the residential schools, you know, they don't understand that lasting legacy of trauma. Not everyone has a trauma therapist in their family. I do, I'm lucky, you know, but even in a family, you know, my kids have been radical feminists from birth, and, you know, we're watching this now, and we're working front lines with Indigenous women, but I know what their worth is in the Canadian government's eyes. But I know what their worth is because I am an Indigenous woman. I am a grandmother. And if it wasn't for my granddaughter, I was ready to walk from everything. But I knew that this movement really needed, you know, needs us. And this is the first time in history that the religious, the radical feminists, and the Indigenous women all got together, and, you know, we were able to do something great. And this day, Terry Jean Bedford is very sick. The dominatrix, she's one of my biggest enemies, and we still fight with her, but I'm protecting all my future granddaughters and all my future relations from that inherent, and, you know, the continuing of genocide towards Indigenous women. And the best way to commit genocide is to hit the women. And I believe that it's not the streets that kill our women, it's not the laws that kill our women, it's the men that are killing our women. And with that, I'd like to say miigwech.
So next we'll have Faye Desjardins, but I just wanted to, we didn't talk about the timer, the timekeeper. Okay, so I'll just make sure we watch.
Oui, bonjour. Hi, mon nom est Faye Desjardins, mais mon nom du gouvernement c'est Lisa Gagné. J'ai eu plusieurs noms, Lisa Bacardi, puis j'honore, pour honorer le nom que ma mère biologique m'a donné, c'est Faye Desjardins, honorer ma mère, ma grand-mère, puis toutes les femmes d'où je viens. Je suis née en Saskatchewan, sur le traité 4 dans l'ouest, Muskaugen, Ojibwe et Sioux. Puis j'ai été adoptée ici au Québec, dans une famille québécoise, à 2 reprises adoptée. Mon histoire est l'histoire de plein d'autres enfants comme moi, de ma génération, qui ont été adoptés à travers le Canada, à travers même l'Europe. Environ 35 000 personnes de ma génération comme moi qui ont un peu le même vécu. Avant de commencer, j'ai mon hochet. Ce qui m'a aidé dans mon parcours de vie, c'est vraiment la reconnexion avec mon identité culturelle et les cérémonies qui sont venues à moi. Puis, je voulais commencer un peu le dialogue par ce que j'entendais les aînés, ce que j'ai appris, moi, pour ma guérison du bagage de violence, des violences que j'ai vécues en étant enfant, des violences sexuelles en étant enfant, mais aussi du bagage de colonisation que les nations autochtones portent au Canada. Chacune d'entre nous, on porte ce bagage-là, en plus de tout notre vécu personnel. Je crois que je suis de la 7e génération depuis la colonisation, puis ma fille, la 8e génération. Puis malheureusement, elle aussi porte ce bagage-là. Mais ce que j'ai appris avec les aînés, c'est que avant la colonisation, les femmes, avec les cérémonies qu'on a vues hier et aujourd'hui avec la cérémonie de l'eau, les femmes, je voudrais honorer les femmes de Haudenosaunee, le territoire sur lequel ici on se rassemble aujourd'hui, c'est le territoire Mohawk, qu'on entend souvent. Mais ce peuple-là était un peuple matrilinéaire. Elle jouait un grand rôle dans les communautés encore aujourd'hui, mais avec l'assimilation, toutes ces connaissances-là se sont fracturées. C'est ça qui est triste, qu'on ne connaît pas, qu'on n'apprend pas ça à l'école. C'est vraiment dans un chemin de vie, le chemin rouge qu'on appelle souvent, qu'on va apprendre ça. Puis c'est comme ça que moi, j'ai pu marcher la tête haute aujourd'hui, sans porter toute la honte d'être une femme, d'être une femme traitée comme un objet, comme si j'étais pas importante. Puis, on est tellement importante. On est les porteuses de vie pour toutes les générations. Puis je voulais... ça fait pas un beau son, là, mais le hochet, ça donne une grande signification. Parce que quand on porte un enfant, le son qui est émis par le hochet va faire en sorte que l'enfant va se sentir bien, va se sentir en sécurité. Puis quand l'enfant vient au monde, son esprit est encore entre les deux. Puis avec le hochet, l'enfant va se souvenir d'où il vient. Il vient du ventre de la mère, mais aussi de la création. Puis quand moi j'écoute le hochet, quand je chante à ma fille, quand elle était bébé, c'est une forme de réconciliation, une forme de guérison, de ne pas vivre avec ce traumatisme-là. Ça me rassure, c'est rassurant. Puis je vais toujours me souvenir les mots d'un grand-père, un Mouchoum, nos grands-pères, qui disait que la femme porte en elle le feu sacré. Les hommes s'occupent du feu, mais les femmes portent et gardent le feu vivant pour la famille, pour la communauté. J'ai pas grandi comme ça, mais aujourd'hui je le comprends bien, parce qu'avec le travail que je fais depuis 20 ans en intervention avec les femmes autochtones, c'est avec elles que j'ai appris mon histoire, les problématiques, l'exploitation que les femmes vivent spécifiquement au Québec. Femmes autochtones, ça a été mon école. Je ne connaissais pas mon histoire non plus à cause des traumatismes. J'ai grandi dans les cantons de l'Est, puis ce que je me souviens, c'est très vague de mon enfance. Les traumatismes, la dissociation et tout ça. J'ai oublié d'où je venais. Mais aujourd'hui, je n'oublie pas. Puis je travaille avec les femmes qui ont oublié qui elles étaient. Je voulais comme honorer les femmes, les générations passées, mes grands-mères, ma mère, aussi les générations du futur. Puis dans les peuples Haudenosaunee, quand on s'assoit, il y a toujours un représentant pour les futures générations. C'est très important. Pour ce que moi je voulais parler, en fait, ce qui m'a été demandé, c'était de parler un peu de la situation, la crise à Val-d'Or que les femmes autochtones ont vécue. Mais pour bien comprendre, parce qu'on est tous au courant de la surreprésentation des femmes autochtones dans l'exploitation sexuelle, mais en ce moment, je travaille dans la prison à Leclerc, puis on vient de finir 176 formations de sensibilisation pour les agents. Puis dans ce processus-là, je me suis aperçue que les agents connaissaient pas l'histoire du Canada dans lequel ils habitent. Et dans le fond, je voulais dresser un portrait un peu, vu que j'ai grandi ici, puis que j'ai travaillé beaucoup avec les organisations au Québec et dans les communautés. Dans un premier temps, vous ne voyez pas la map, là, mais c'est un vaste territoire, la Grande Tortue. Mais le Québec est très vaste aussi. Et au Québec, nous avons 11 nations autochtones, 10 nations des Premières Nations et les nations inuites dans le Grand Nord, ce qui comprend 41 communautés autochtones à travers le Québec et dont 14 communautés inuites dans le Grand Nord. Fait que nous avons les nations Abénaquis, Algonquin, Atikamekw, Cri, Huron-Wendat, Innu, les Malécites, les Mi'kmaq, les Mohawks, les Naskapi et les Inuits. Un fait important concernant les Inuits, ma collègue qui est Inuit, qui travaille avec les femmes Inuits, me disait qu'elle a 40 ans. Puis elle dit la colonisation pour nous, c'est pas super lointain. Moi, je suis née, sa mère est née dans un igloo, puis elle est née à l'hôpital. Fait que ça fait pas 50 ans. Fait que les problématiques qui vivent dans le Grand Nord sont d'actualité. La colonisation, beaucoup de problématiques ressurgissent à cause du peu de temps de l'assimilation. J'ai toutes pris mes notes en anglais, et je vais peut-être changer du français à l'anglais. Mais nous avons, à travers le Canada, 630 communautés autochtones. Fait que c'est beaucoup de nations. Puis quand j'ai grandi dans les cantons de l'Est, juste pour vous donner une idée, là, je pensais qu'on était les seuls, j'étais la seule survivante avec mes sœurs, qu'il n'y avait plus d'autres Premières Nations. Puis personne m'enseignait l'histoire du Canada. Et aujourd'hui, je connais mon histoire. Puis le curriculum du Québec est mal fait parce que les gens ne connaissent pas leur histoire. On est encore dans le passé, si vous voulez. Je sais pas. Il reste. Ah, mon père. Ah, ça passe vite le temps. Il y a tellement de choses à dire. Je n'ai même pas abordé ce que je voulais aborder. Mais pendant la crise à Val-d'Or, j'étais présente. Je travaillais sur des projets en itinérance et on avait ouvert la maison Nigan avec la clé là-bas. Mélanie Monceau qui est ici, on a beaucoup collaboré ensemble dans ce projet-là. Puis, j'ai beaucoup appris aussi. Ce que j'ai appris en intervention, beaucoup a été à Val-d'Or et avec les femmes que je côtoyais dans la rue et les hommes aussi. Dans la culture autochtone, on parle beaucoup d'une approche, on dit une approche autochtone, une approche familiale. Alors, quand on intervient pas seulement avec la femme, on intervient avec les enfants, l'homme, les aînés. C'est tout toute la communauté, en fait. C'est cette approche-là avec laquelle on va travailler en tout temps dans l'environnement, si vous voulez. Et ça a été un travail qui m'a vraiment marqué à cause que ces femmes-là ont été courageuses de dénoncer cette situation-là d'abus policiers. Puis, la raison pourquoi qu'elles avaient décidé de parler, c'est en lien avec la disparition de Cindy Rupert House, une femme autochtone de Picogan qui, malheureusement, vivait beaucoup de vulnérabilité dans les rues. Puis, elle est disparue Elle est disparue dans le printemps de 2014. Puis moi, la dernière fois que je l'avais vue, elle avait décidé de faire un retour à l'école, puis on s'était croisés à l'UQAT, puis elle m'avait parlé de son projet. Puis pas longtemps après, elle est disparue, puis elle est toujours disparue en ce moment. Puis la journaliste de Radio-Canada avait été venue à Val-d'Or pour entendre les histoires de ces femmes-là. Puis finalement, les femmes ont parlé en son nom. Ils ne voulaient pas parler, mais pour Cindy, pour qu'on retrouve Cindy. 10 femmes ont partagé leurs histoires devant les médias. Et s'ensuit la crise à Val-d'Or, un processus qui a été très traumatisant, dans le sens que les policiers qui avaient été dénoncés refusaient un peu ce qui avait été dénoncé d'eux. Les mauvais traitements. Chaque jour, j'ai travaillé 8 ans à Val-d'Or dans les rues. Chaque jour, j'entendais les histoires d'abus policiers. Puis, dans la ville de Val-d'Or, ce que je trouvais intéressant dans mon parcours là-bas, c'est que le territoire pour les Premières Nations, la Mère Terre, c'est un endroit, la Mère Terre, c'est elle qui nous donne tout ce qu'on a besoin. Et il y a des grandes minières dans le Nord, il y a beaucoup d'exploitation. Quand on parle du Grand Nord, bien, il y a l'exploitation est partout. Et moi, j'avais fait le lien avec l'exploitation des femmes. Majoritairement, l'exploitation se fait par les hommes sur le territoire. Alors s'ensuit l'augmentation de risques pour les femmes par rapport à la criminalité, la consommation de drogue, l'exploitation. Fait que nos femmes et nos filles sont en danger et sont toujours en danger. C'est encore d'actualité. Et encore aujourd'hui, la criminalité pénètre dans toutes nos communautés du Nord. C'est très présent. Puis le travail que je fais avec les femmes en prison, les femmes du moment, quand je travaillais à Val-d'Or, j'y retrouve toutes présentement dans l'établissement Leclerc. Puis il n'y a pas de changement. Il n'y a pas eu de changement. Puis on dirait qu'ils ont abandonné leurs actions. Puis avec Femmes autochtones, en 2018, il y avait eu des actions très concrètes en lien avec l'exploitation sexuelle. Et c'était tabou. On ne parlait pas. Certaines communautés ne voulaient pas qu'on aille donner des formations sur la violence sexuelle parce qu'ils n'étaient pas rendus encore dans ce processus-là. Parce que nous étions encore dans le processus de porter le bagage colonial de la loi sur les Indiens, la discrimination. Alors, c'est dur de lutter en même temps sur toutes ces causes-là, mais juste d'être en réconciliation. Quand on parle de réconciliation, quand tu as été victime des pensionnats, de l'exploitation, l'assimilation, ben, tu portes un bagage colonial qui est très présent, avec un historique traumatique. Mais en plus de ça, se rajoute l'exploitation encore présent aujourd'hui. Alors c'est difficile de reconnaître ça, de savoir c'est quoi. Beaucoup de femmes ne nommaient pas qu'ils faisaient de la prostitution. Ils ne nommaient pas parce que c'était tellement tabou. Puis encore aujourd'hui, quand je parle avec les femmes, ils ne nomment pas, mais ils relatent les faits de ce qu'ils vivent quand ils vont sortir, où ils vont être, qui retournent dans cette exploitation-là. Et malheureusement, les investissements, c'est pas là qu'ils vont. L'argent ne va pas là. Il n'y a pas de service adapté aux besoins de ces femmes-là. Nigan, Mélanie me disait que c'est même plus, ça n'existe plus. C'est un endroit comme une maison pour elles, de venir prendre leur douche, de prendre leur bain. C'est des projets comme ça qui sont importants pour nos femmes. Puis le retour sur le territoire, parce que le territoire est important pour nos femmes dans la guérison.
Northern Cree and Lakota Sioux. And when I was growing up, let me go back a bit. So I'm going to talk about my mother. My late mother, Lucy. She was an Indian residential school survivor. And she was not equipped with the tools and the upbringing to be the mother that she could have been. And when I was 1 year old, she abandoned me for the first time and went back to her home province of Alberta. And I stayed with my father. And the part of Saskatchewan that I grew up in was a rural, predominantly white farming community. My sister and I, we were the only Indigenous children in the school. It was a kindergarten to grade 12 school, with the odd Indigenous foster child that would come through the community, but they never stayed too long. I remember in kindergarten being called racial slurs such as squaw, dirty Indian. It was very much encouraged and normalized to be racist against Indigenous people. Mind you, it was not tolerated for other people of color, but against Indigenous people, it was pretty much open season. So I've been combating racism for a very long time. But what I'm going to share with you today is, I guess we're talking about it more now, but the insidiousness of racism, which is embedded in the sex trade. And obviously I can't pack, many years of my life in just a few minutes here with you today, but I will share with you. It wasn't until I started sharing my story as a survivor of commercialized sexual exploitation that I started making connections with, what happened with my mother's abandonment. And unfortunately, when I was 16, I left basically one abusive household and went to another. But I went from rural community to Edmonton, which is the capital city of Alberta. Now, Edmonton to me was like New York City. It was very exciting to be there. It was the first time I ever lived with my mother. We lived in a very low-income neighborhood, and the visibility of children being sold in the sex trade was very much out in the open. Now, obviously, it's gone much more underground now that things have moved more online. But these are images that were pretty much, it was happening, but nothing was really being done about it, right? And it's still happening. But when I was 16, my mother abandoned me for a second time. So this was the first time I had lived with my mom. But it didn't take long for her to move out of province to Vancouver. and I was a homeless youth in Edmonton. Now, at that time, I was hanging out with an older crowd. I was pretty much on the verge of dropping out of high school. I tried to get a regular job, but I met, I would say she was probably one of my first groomers. Her name, and I don't even know if this was her real name, but her name was Teresa, older white lady. She took me under her wing. She said she was a retired bikini model. And she said she had an opportunity for me to make some money. And she took me around to different nightclubs in Edmonton and entered me in bikini contests. And I was underage, and she knew that. If I did place in these contests, she would keep most of the money. But through her, I met other people that were involved in like the world of stripping and escorting. And, but I wasn't, at that point, I didn't turn out, like I didn't sell sex at that point, but it was through many different people and networks that I was being groomed. And the more that I share my story, the more that I'm learning about my own story, is that I was actually groomed at a much younger age than in my teen years. Because as a child, I was exposed to family violence. I was exposed to pornography. So from a very young age, I learned the very wrong way that my only value was what people could use me for sexually. Now, again, this is hard to unpack in just a few minutes, but at that time I had an older boyfriend. He introduced me to powder cocaine. He was very abusive. I eventually got away from him and went back to Saskatchewan, which I swore I'd never go back. But I ended up in Saskatoon. And I tried to keep a regular job. At that point, I was working at a McDonald's early morning. And then at night, I worked in a nightclub. And through the nightclub scene in Saskatoon, now I'm 19, and I meet this very popular young lady. She presented herself as Latina, but she was actually Indigenous. She had been turned out in Regina. She was being sold in a underground strip club in Regina. But anyway, she was out in the nightclub scene recruiting girls, and I was one of her targets. But I looked up to her, as many of us did, and she knew that I worked this part-time job at McDonald's and then nighttime in the club scene. And she offered me and other girls an opportunity to make some money on the side, a little side hustle. And she said, yeah, there was these houses just off of downtown Saskatoon where you can go and make a few extra dollars giving topless or lingerie massages. And because I'd already been conditioned, it didn't seem that far off from a bikini pageant. It didn't seem, you know, yes, a bit scary, but it didn't seem that it would be too bad, right? So I ended up in these places, but one thing I wanted to point out that she was very serious about, so she knew I was Indigenous, because I've never been ashamed of being Indigenous, but she said, if you self-identify as Indigenous to the Johns, you are more likely to be raped, robbed, or murdered. So you need to sell yourself as something else. And that's what happened to me. And for several years, I ended up being sold in different, what's called circuit cities. So I ended up in Vancouver. And these are all through networked, organized crime rings. And through my connections in Edmonton, I ended up in Fort McMurray. Fort McMurray, by far, was the worst circuit city I'd ever been sold in. Me and other young women were on shift for 23 hours a day for 2 weeks. I eventually ended up across the border. So because I'm First Nation, I have an opportunity to be dual citizen with the United States. So I ended up getting my US citizenship, and I ended up in Las Vegas, and then eventually in New York City. New York City almost took my life. And I shared my story as a survivor anonymously, because when the National Inquiry came through Edmonton, at that time I hadn't gone public with my story as a survivor. But I really wanted to emphasize the cross-border nature of sexual exploitation and what had happened to me, and that it went undetected. And that if I would have been murdered in New York or gone missing in New York, who would have come looking for me? My family didn't know where I was. I barely kept in contact with anyone in Canada. And I really do believe that, especially for us Indigenous women being sexually exploited, the recruiters, the traffickers, the groomers, I believe that they see us as a different kind of commodity, because depending on what color my hair was, how it was styled, how I was dressed, how I applied my makeup, I could pass for different races. And to them, that's a commodity. Honestly, I don't believe that, I don't believe when I shared my story with the National Inquiry that I was believed. And as survivors, it's very important that we have that sense of compassion and that we are believed, because it takes a lot of courage to share. I still carry a lot of trauma that I don't even understand. I get triggered all the time. But I can say that I'm a mother now, and I have not abandoned my children, and I've forgiven my mom. We made peace before she passed away last December. I'm really just moved by all of you in this room. I want to point out someone very special who I want to get to know better. Hopefully she takes me back home. Nina Kay, if you could stand up, sister. I just want to acknowledge you. So we, we met through Facebook. It was during the pandemic, and obviously a lot of us spent a lot of time in front of screens. And I think it was a documentary or a news article, and she was featuring her story. And her story resonated with me because I was turned out at 19 as well. And I thought, what is going on here? Like, she's from across the world, and I can relate with her so much. And I just prayed, and I thought, I really hope one day we can meet. And I didn't want to come off as a creeper, but I sent her a friend request and she accepted, and I was kind of fangirling at that time. But she accepted my request, and unfortunately we lost contact, but I seen her yesterday and my heart was just so full of love, and I appreciate you, and I know we're going to do some amazing work together, sister. Thank you. So with that, miracles happen. I'm here to be a voice for those whose voices were stolen. And let's just keep going. I just wanted to leave you with a quote from Senator Marie Sinclair. Hopefully it'll inspire you, because it inspired me. As long as our hearts are aimed in the right direction and we're moving in the right way, we will get there. Hi, can I ask something?
Next, we have Diane Redshead.
I gotta put on my old lady glasses. So my bio is in the package, so I'm not gonna go over that, but I want to highlight just a couple things because I think it's important when it comes to people who are here from outside of Canada. So, but first, bonjour, Shweganun Adishnakaza Dikdodam. I just introduced myself in my traditional way from the Ojibwe Nation in Northwestern Ontario. My First Nation is Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, which is in Treaty 3, and I work there, but I live in Treaty 1 territory. I'd like to acknowledge all of the land here, all of the sacred fires that connect all Indigenous people here in Canada. I'd also like to acknowledge these survivors and acknowledge our sisters who are in the spirit world who couldn't be here, for reasons we all know. So just a couple of things I'd like to, okay. And this, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it is available. Yeah, we'll keep it on for a bit and maybe people can take pictures. but we can email it out as well, because the organizers have this. So I live in a province in Manitoba, which is the center of Canada, and we had the only provincial strategy to address sexual exploitation and sex trafficking in Canada for 16 years. So from 2000 to 2016, Manitoba had a strategy that was pumping in $11 million annually to a population of 1.2 million people. So that's about $9 a person. Because you need to have a provincial strategy, because when you're looking for it, it's there. And when you're not looking for it, people tend to ignore things. And so I'm fortunate to work with community leaders and be able to represent grassroots organizations to support that strategy. The second strategy is in Ontario, which came up in 2016. Nowhere near the Manitoba one, but at least it's something. But those are the only two provinces in our whole country that have a provincial strategy where they are intentionally making plans to address it. I worked for an organization in Winnipeg, Manitoba called the Mama-Wichita Center. I just recently left there a year ago to work for my First Nation. And we operated 2 programs for girls 13 to 17 years of age. One is a safe house in the city of Winnipeg, and the second is the only rural healing lodge in Canada for teenage girls who have been exploited, sexually exploited and trafficked. And so, you know, we have a long way to go when there should be, and there needs to be, rural healing lodges everywhere across our country. I led a national task force on sex trafficking of women in Canada. I testified at the National Inquiry, and I also testified as part of the law that's up there, and it's been talked about already, to protect the law. Oh, jeez, no, what's going on here? I'm also not good at computers. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about here today is about Indigenous women. And so there's some statistics. We're 5% of the population. You'll notice that there are First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and non-status. Again, I encourage you to research what those are, but we are these are specific governments of First Nation, Métis, Inuit that exist here in our country. While we make up 5% of the population, we're overrepresented everywhere. We are between 60 and 90% population in jails and child welfare. We have poor education and health and employment outcomes, but there's a reason for that, because it was intentional to destroy and to eliminate Indigenous people in Canada. And we only had the apology from our government, which was kind of half-assed anyways, in 2015. And so we are been doing a lot to rebuild our nations, particularly because many of our nations were operated by our matriarchs. We operated matriarchal societies, and so we have, I'm just gonna struggle with this thing. So many of us are reclaiming our matriarchal societies now, but there was an intentional effort made by our government to destroy and attack our families. And while that may be historical, where it started, it continues through various government policies today. And many of the leaders that are here at this table and out in the audience, we continue to advocate and work together so that we can advance the Indigenous and human rights of Indigenous women in Canada. So part of how Canada set up this intentional act to attack our families and attack us is through the Indian Act. And you've heard a few people bring that up, but I want to just unpack that just a little bit, because the Indian Act is a set of laws and legislation in Canada that have created more rules and more restrictions for First Nations people because the Indian Act was established because we were considered less than human. So we need more rules and we need more restrictions because we're considered less than human. So that legislation continues on. It was updated only in 1951, like small updates, but overhauled in 1951. So for a while, we weren't able to leave our First Nation communities. We were not able to hire a lawyer. We weren't able to practice our ceremonies. 2 minutes already? Are you sure? Okay. I thought it was 12 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay, so I just want to give you an example of what it's like to paint the picture of being a First Nation woman in Canada. So we're living in a First Nation community. Women cannot have our house in our name because our only way we are recognized is being attached to a man. So we have to be, we only have agency because of who our father is or because of who our mother, our husbands are. And so when there's violence in the home and somebody has to leave, it's always the woman that has to leave. We're overrepresented in systems, so the CFS really replaced the residential school system, the justice system. We're over-policed and under-protected. Indigenous women are criminalized for being poor. Because of the majority of Indigenous women incarcerated is related to poverty. The education system pushes us out. We are not getting the jobs due to racism. So it's not a surprise that we have poor health outcomes due to the stress. There's racism we experience in the healthcare system. In fact, we are literally ignored to death. And we don't have enough money for the healthy food that we need. So it's cheaper to buy a 2-liter Pepsi than it is to buy milk. We are up against the harmful stereotypes. You just have to look to even Disney through Pocahontas and that whole story about, sexualizing who we are. Our national police just announced Indigenous RCMP officers are now going to wear ribbon skirts. Yet they arrest us in our own ribbon skirts, which are ceremonial, which is part of our ceremony, practices of ceremony. The funding for services in Canada largely go to non-Indigenous organizations who are serving our people. And that's wrong, because we have the answers and the solutions, and we need the funding to be able to help our own people. And so funding Indigenous-led organizations is far underrepresented in everything that needs to happen. So we have to make life-saving decisions every day in the work we do. Just the last thing I want to mention is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry started in 2016, ended June 3rd, so tomorrow is a 5-year anniversary, ended in June 3rd, 2019, and concluded the actions that Canada has taken towards Indigenous women in Canada result in genocide. And we are still at this place 5 years later with still the lack of resources going to Indigenous-led organizations to serve our own people. And so while we got a long way to go, we do have, and I want to honor the survivor voice. I want to honor all of the leaders that are at this table and in the audience that are always advocating for the voice of Indigenous women in our country. Next
I have Dave Warren.
Please talk. Gay is what talk come. Kot egatumus egat uknakaptinishtin. I just wanted my ancestors and my relatives to acknowledge and greet the ancestors of the people whose territory we're on. I also wanted to speak in my language because I want you to know that it's on the verge of extinction, as are many languages across this country. My time has been cut in half, I think, but I just wanted to say that as a radical feminist from the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, my main focus is on the gendered nature of colonialism, the gendered nature of racism, and the gendered nature of poverty. And with my involvement in the national inquiry, that is what I noticed, is that women got completely lost in the process. There was no women at the end of the day. And when you look at the first item, which is genocide, who does genocide happen to? It happens to a nation of people. And it doesn't focus specifically on what happened to Indigenous women in that process. And the other area where there isn't a whole, and this is an area that AWON, the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, is really concerned about, are mothers, Indigenous mothers, where child apprehension is happening. We have a lot of Indigenous people focused on the importance of protecting those children, rightly so, but there isn't any discourse, any conversation on the needs of the mother. And we're very colonized that way. The Indian Act, Diane referred to the 1951 amendment to the Indian Act when the provincial authorities stepped in and had huge financial reward for stealing our children. There was huge motivation to steal our children because there was huge dollar amounts attached to that, attached to our children that go into the public school system, and also a reward for putting us into the special needs category without any accountability. If you wonder why Indigenous peoples are not educated, Diane put it very aptly. It was designed that way. They didn't want us to have an education. Education didn't happen in residential school, and it doesn't happen today. Overwhelmingly Indigenous children, and that's my background in education, so I'm interested how many educators are in the room and how many are complicit in keeping our children uneducated. When I taught basic literacy, my students had grade 12 certificates but were illiterate and couldn't access my program because they were testing below grade 3.7. I don't know if I'm halfway through yet. I wanted to read this quote and just get to this point really quickly. You know, I really take offense to the non-Native women that are advocating and advancing prostitution as sex work. But I take greater offense to Indigenous women doing that. And this is a quote from an Indigenous woman, Sarah Hunt. She says, Indigenous sex work has been conflated with sexual exploitation, domestic trafficking, intergenerational violence, and the disappearances or abductions of Indigenous women and girls. Like, how do you create silos then? You know, that's my question to her is, do we silo off the fact that my experience, even though I never landed up in prostitution, is very similar to my sisters at the end there. You know, there were so many offenders in my life, sexual abuse at 3 years old, you know, homelessness at 13 when I was running away, all of that. But this woman promotes this argument that, you know, those things don't matter when it comes to Indigenous women engaging in prostitution or sex work. It's an absolute lie. And she's telling us a bold-faced lie that Indigenous women are choosing and consenting to paid rape. And I find that very offensive, very offensive. But because I'm panicked and not having any time, I think what I'll do is begin to read the declaration that we developed. So the Aboriginal Women's Action Network attended the Women's World Conference in, I think it was 2010, and we spoke out on this very topic, and in fact, I think we played a huge role in that conference and brought a lot of attention to what was happening to women in prostitution. So we developed the first draft of the declaration then, and then when we began to organize and prepare to come here, we decided that we were going to revise and revamp that declaration. So I'm going to read the first part, and Mackenzie at the end there hasn't mentioned, but she's also a member of the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, and she will read our demands, and this can be available to anybody and everybody that wants it, and we hope that we hope you like it. Okay, so number one, we Indigenous women, which, you know, by that we mean the Aboriginal Women's Action Network, will not allow anyone or anything to break the ties that bind us. Despite the unrelenting forces working to divide us and the impacts of gendered colonialism, gendered racism, gendered poverty, intergenerational trauma, misogyny, and violence that pervades our lives and our communities, we are profoundly aware of our connectedness to each other as women, to our ancestors, and to our lands. No man, or any of these external forces will sever these ties. 2, our view of prostitution is that it sits on a continuum of male violence alongside pornography, incest, childhood sexual exploitation, trafficking, rape, assault, coercive control, torture, and other ways that men violate Indigenous women and girls. These forms of male violence have been an integral part of colonization, executed upon us through many patriarchal portions of the Indian Act, the sexualized violence in the residential school system, the coercive treaty-making process on the prairies and other similar colonization instruments. With 5 centuries of resistance stories told and retold by our aunties, our grandmothers, and with our lived experiences, the experiences of our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, and all our relations, we have come to understand the devastation of prostitution, the murders of far too many of us, and the formidable journey out of that destruction. And we are journeying out of that destruction. We reject the racist assumption that prostitution has ever been part of our traditional practices. That's number 3. We denounce the common sense belief of Canadian societies that our sole worth is as sexual objects to be bought and sold, purchasable or universally available to any man. And I can attest to that in the city, even though I'm an old lady, getting propositioned, and many others have shared that story where we're seen to be sexually available at all times. I'm just about finished reading. Number 4, we repudiate the claim that prostitution can be sex work, a freely chosen form of labor. The parallels between the rape and theft of our homelands and our environment and the rape and exploitation of Indigenous women and girls are evident in the storytelling of Indigenous women. And we especially reject Sarah Hunt's claim that Indigenous sex work has been, I already read that, conflated with all those. Our grandmothers make it abundantly clear that there is a link, not a conflation, between the atrocities and vulnerabilities listed in that quote and our future opportunities. That unmitigated damage or the links are unveiled in research that shows the pipeline between children in foster care and trafficked children onto survival prostitution. With the denial of access to education, employment, health, housing, equitable social services, Indigenous women have minimal opportunities that are afforded to other Canadian women and to both Canadian and Indigenous men. The result is that Indigenous women end up leading in all of the statistics for survival prostitution in urban centers and other parts of the country. The term sex work serves to obscure the facts, the racist, misogynist, and classist realities of prostitution. Number 5, we stand with our Indigenous sisters, our Inuit sisters, our Métis sisters, and our First Nation sisters, many of whom are women with disabilities, and who withstand daily paid rape and extreme forms of violence and torture in prostitution. Survivors have told us about the post-traumatic stress disorder that comes from a lifetime of prostitution. Number 6, we strive to obliterate the imposed patriarchy that has had devastating and deadly effects on Indigenous women and girls. The male violence that we contend with in our own families and communities often drive us into urban areas seeking safety. As refugees in our own homelands, we encounter increased levels of male violence, including at the hands of John's pimps and brothel owners and traffickers. It is mainly at these sites that our sisters have been murdered and disappeared, an eye-popping and unremitting reality in which Indigenous women are excluded from the remedy. The Indian Act chiefs, sometimes the perpetrators of violence women and girls face, are the favored bodies that governments fund at the exclusion of Indigenous women's groups. Number 7, the last point. Poverty and homelessness are factors that force Indigenous women into survival prostitution in Canadian ghettos, and non-Indigenous agencies that serve Indigenous women often become the poverty pimps that draw on the harm reduction models to maintain a holding pattern of keeping funding sources and service recipients in place. These horrendous conditions frequently result in drug addiction, a plight in today's toxic drug supply that leads to their death.
Thank you, Faye. I'm going to read AWON's demands. So we're speaking as the Aboriginal Women's Action Network. So number 1, AWON fully supports the Nordic model, also known as the equity model, which decriminalizes women in prostitution but criminalizes male demand for paid sex. The second element of the Nordic model is comprehensive social programming for all women and girls. The third element involves societal education and public awareness regarding prostitution as a form of male violence against women and girls. We believe this model encourages true social change that works in our interest. 2, we are deeply opposed to the total decriminalization or legalization of prostitution, a system that disproportionately targets Indigenous women and girls. 3, we demand that the federal and provincial governments focus state programming related to gender-based violence on autonomous Indigenous women's groups instead of the current target of Indian Act Chiefs organizations. Further, we demand that governments acknowledge and recognize through policy and legislation the importance of matriarchal traditions of the many First Nations across this country. 4, we demand an end to the exclusion of the wisdom and authority of Indigenous mothers in the onslaught of child welfare authorities across the country. The gendered colonialism, gendered racism, gendered poverty that targets Indigenous mothers for the apprehension of our children is a crime of genocide, and the construction of a pipeline into prostitution and other forms of marginalization. Indigenous mothers must have a privileged voice in the creation, governance, and operation of a new Indigenous child welfare authorities. 5, because Indigenous women with disabilities are targeted by pimps, human traffickers, due to their increased vulnerabilities and their higher degree of marginalization, we demand that in addition to research and analysis be earmarked for increased understanding and improved services designed, directed, maintained by Indigenous women with disabilities. 6, Indigenous women experience sexualized violence in all spaces across this country and beyond. We demand that Indigenous women in prison be freed of sexualized violence while incarcerated. This includes ensuring that frontline staff in prison are female and that male-bodied prisoners not be permitted into women's prisons. Ultimately, A1 demands that prisons for women be abolished. 7, the main intersectional forms of oppression that Indigenous women contend with have resulted in extreme marginalization, a situation that can be remedied by a guaranteed livable income. With the amount of labor required to do healing work, to obtain an education, and to establish a quality of life, Indigenous women in prostitution would significantly benefit from GLI and enhanced exiting opportunities. 8, we demand targeted health and healing programs by and for Indigenous women. This includes, but is not limited to, detox and inpatient treatment programs, exiting services for Indigenous women to escape prostitution, literacy and higher education, life skills and employment programs, and many more. A1 is especially disturbed by the absence of exiting services that are run by and for Indigenous women. The 2 barriers are the harm reduction models that prevent speaking about leaving prostitution and the Christian programming that currently exists. 9, unlearning patriarchy and misogyny is a daunting task that absolutely must occur. The expression, "nothing about us without us," is fitting in the circumstance. This third element of the Nordic model is the best fulfilled by further research on Indigenous women in prostitution, demographic data on the pipelines from child welfare and trafficking into prostitution, and needs assessment on the ability of Indigenous women to escape prostitution. We, Indigenous women and girls, have survived over 500 years of attacks on our culture, our bodies, our land, and our lives. We refuse to abandon our future generations to the colonial sexist violence that is prostitution. And we demand an immediate end to the male violence demand for paid sex. We demand a return to our traditional values that place Indigenous women and girls in high esteem. So I just want to say thank you to each of these women, and I too hold you in high esteem. I thank you for your generosity and sharing your stories, your personal lives. Each of you could have spoken to us for many hours, so I really appreciate the work that you're doing, the healing that you've done, the healing that you'll continue to do, and the women that you love and care for. Thank you.